My granddaughter did not raise her voice when she saved my life. She leaned against my shoulder at breakfast, stared at the cup in my hand, and whispered, "Grandpa, don't drink it." I smiled so nobody would notice. Then I carried that coffee out of my own kitchen. By the following evening, a laboratory had identified what was inside it, and my son's entire future had begun collapsing. Welcome back to another family revenge story where the cruelest betrayals rarely arrive shouting. Sometimes they wear clean shirts, carry legal folders, and ask whether you remembered taking your vitamins. Get comfortable, because this story begins with a child's whisper and ends with two adults discovering that love may delay consequences, but it does not erase them. My name is Malcolm Reed, and this happened in Savannah, Georgia. I was 67 years old, widowed for 6 years, and still running Reed Marine Works, the boatyard my father started beside the Wilmington River in 1968. We repaired shrimp boats, restored old sailboats, and built custom launches for people with more money than patience. I had spent 43 years keeping that business alive through hurricanes, recessions, lawsuits, and one fire that nearly took everything. My only son, Evan, was 38. He had my height, his mother's smile, and the dangerous confidence of a man who had never been forced to measure how much of his success belonged to him. I gave him a management position, introduced him to clients, guaranteed his first mortgage, and covered mistakes that would have ended another employee's career. I called it helping. Looking back, I was financing entitlement. Evan's daughter, Sophie, was 10. Her mother, Claire, died in a highway accident when Sophie was 4, and after that, the child became the quiet center of my life. 3 years later, Evan married Vanessa Hale, a polished real estate consultant who could make concern sound like affection and judgment sound like common sense. Vanessa never yelled. She preferred sentences that made other people doubt themselves. For the first 2 years, I told myself she was simply organized. She labeled pantry shelves, rescheduled family dinners without asking, and spoke about Reed Marine as though it were an underperforming property. Then she began noticing things about me. I had repeated a story. I had misplaced my glasses. I had forgotten whether a board meeting started at 9 or 9:30. Ordinary mistakes became evidence in her hands. Vanessa started saying cognitive decline so casually that the phrase entered the house like humidity. Evan began watching me after I answered questions, waiting to see if I would contradict myself. Once, when I dropped a wrench at the boatyard, he exchanged a look with her. It lasted less than a second, but fathers know their sons' faces. That look said they had been discussing me when I was absent. The Sunday, everything changed. They came to my river house for brunch. Vanessa brought a cinnamon cake, Evan carried a leather portfolio, and Sophie arrived wearing the yellow raincoat I had bought her even though the sky was clear. She hugged me longer than usual. When I asked whether something was wrong, she glanced toward the kitchen and said, "I just missed you." Her voice was too careful. Vanessa insisted on making coffee. That was unusual because she considered my old percolator a museum exhibit, but she moved around my kitchen with bright efficiency, telling Evan to open curtains and asking Sophie to set the table. I sat near the window watching sunlight move across the river. When Vanessa placed my blue mug beside me, Sophie's small hand tightened around her fork. I lifted the cup. Sophie slid from her chair, leaned against my arm as if asking for syrup, and whispered, "Grandpa, don't drink it." She put something in there. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not look at Evan. I kissed Sophie's hair, set the cup down, and said I had forgotten the newspaper outside. Then I carried the mug with me as though nothing mattered. On the porch, I poured half the coffee into a clean stainless travel bottle from my truck and sealed it. I returned with the mug still warm, raised it twice without drinking, and let Vanessa see the level had dropped. Her shoulders relaxed. That detail stayed with me. Innocent people do not watch a man's coffee closely enough to feel relief when some disappears. During brunch, Vanessa asked whether I had signed the updated medical release she emailed. Evan opened the leather portfolio and said it was just housekeeping, something every family should prepare before a crisis. I told him I would review it later. He pushed the folder closer. Sophie stared at her plate. Beneath the table, her shoe touched mine and stayed there like a warning bell. I had known Dr. Lena Ortiz for 25 years. She was a toxicologist at a private clinical laboratory and the daughter of a welder who once worked for my father. At 11:15 that morning, I called her from the boatyard office. I did not dramatize anything. I said I had a sealed beverage that might contain medication and asked whether she could arrange a documented analysis. Her silence lasted 3 seconds. "Bring it directly to me," she said. "Do not leave it in your vehicle, and do not confront anyone." Lena had never been theatrical, which made the warning heavier. I drove across Savannah with the bottle upright in a cooler. At the lab, she photographed the seal, logged the sample, and had me sign a chain of custody form. Suddenly, my granddaughter's whisper became evidence. The preliminary call came at 4:48 that afternoon. I remember the exact time because the shipyard whistle had just sounded and gulls were circling above the dry dock. Lena's voice was controlled but not calm. The coffee contained zolpidem, a prescription sleep medication, and clonazepam, another sedative. Together in that concentration, they could cause confusion, memory gaps, poor coordination, and dangerous respiratory depression. I sat behind my father's old oak desk and stared at the river. Over the previous month, I had awakened twice in my recliner without remembering falling asleep. I had stumbled on the back steps after dinner at Evan's house. I had signed a vendor approval I did not remember reviewing. Vanessa had been present each time. So had coffee, tea, or the evening bourbon she liked to pour for me. Lena asked whether I had consumed any of the sample. I told her no. She instructed me to visit an emergency physician anyway and have blood drawn because repeated exposure might leave traces or explain recent symptoms. I went through the side entrance of Memorial Health where an old client's daughter worked in administration. Privacy mattered now. I no longer knew how far the story had traveled. The hospital found a low residual level of clonazepam in my system, even though I had never been prescribed it. The physician looked at my chart, then at me, and asked whether anyone had access to my food or medication. I thought of Vanessa's labeled pantry bins, Evan's new habit of filling my pill organizer, and the spare key I had given them after Hurricane Idalia. By 7 that evening, I was not frightened anymore. Fear burns quickly in men my age. What remains is calculation. I called Detective Nora Briggs, a financial crimes investigator I knew through a marina fraud case, and told her everything. She said poisoning allegations belonged with major crimes, but the corporate motive made her listen differently. She asked one question first: who benefits if people believe you are incompetent? That question opened the whole room. Under Reed Marine's succession agreement, if I became medically incapacitated, temporary voting control passed to the designated operating successor. 3 years earlier, I had named Evan. The shipyard sat on 18 riverfront acres, now worth more to condominium developers than to boat builders. Vanessa had mentioned that fact at least 12 times in 6 months. There was another layer. A development company called Hale Meridian had offered $41 million for the property. Vanessa's older brother, Grant Hale, was one of its silent partners. I had rejected the offer twice. Evan called me sentimental. Vanessa called me financially irresponsible. I called it refusing to erase 3 generations of work so strangers could install rooftop pools where welders once fed their families. Detective Briggs told me not to change my routine yet. She wanted the full laboratory report, medical results, and any documents Evan had presented. She also wanted Sophie protected without alerting Vanessa. That was the hardest part. Sophie lived under their roof. I could move against adults, banks, boards, and contracts. A 10-year-old child required patience, precision, and no mistakes. I called my neighbor Ruth Bell, a retired elementary principal who had known Sophie since birth. The next morning, Ruth invited her over to help prepare costumes for a school play. Evan agreed because Vanessa had a client luncheon. Once Sophie was safely in Ruth's sunroom, I sat beside her with a glass of lemonade and asked her to tell me exactly what she had seen. Sophie said Vanessa kept small white packets inside an empty collagen container. On 3 mornings, she watched her tear one open and stir powder into my mug before calling me to breakfast. The first time, Sophie assumed it was sweetener. The second time, she heard Vanessa tell Evan he was foggy for 6 hours. We need the evaluation scheduled while the pattern is consistent. On Saturday night, Sophie had walked downstairs for water and heard them arguing in the study. Evan said the dosage was too much. Vanessa answered, "Then stop acting frightened and remember what happens if he sells the company before control transfers." Sophie did not understand every word. She understood my name, the word dosage, and the fact that her father lowered his voice when he said, "What if he falls?" I asked what Vanessa had answered. Sophie's eyes filled before she spoke. She said, "Then we call it another episode." I had believed I understood betrayal until that sentence. Money can explain greed. Fear can explain cowardice. But planning how to describe a man's injury before causing it belongs to a colder category. My son had heard those words and remained in the room. I told Sophie none of this was her fault. She asked whether her father would go to jail. I said adults were responsible for their own choices and that my first job was keeping her safe. She nodded, then reached into her raincoat pocket and handed me a tiny black memory card. I took it from Dad's camera, she said. I thought they might delete it. Evan had installed indoor security cameras after claiming I wandered at night. One camera faced the kitchen supposedly to monitor whether I left the stove on. Sophie knew the recordings were stored locally because Evan had shown her how to retrieve a clip of their dog stealing chicken. The card held 14 days of footage. Detective Briggs watched it in my attorney's conference room. There was Vanessa opening the collagen container. There was Evan standing 6 feet away. There was the powder falling into my cup. On another recording, Vanessa guided my unsteady hand toward a signature page while Evan filmed me from across the counter. The document was titled Petition for Emergency Protective Management. They were not merely waiting for me to decline. They were manufacturing the decline. My attorney, Martin Shaw, had represented Reed Marine for 31 years. He removed his glasses after watching the footage and rubbed both eyes. Then he pulled the leather portfolio Evan had left behind from an evidence bag. Buried beneath the medical release was a voting proxy, a durable power of attorney and authorization to negotiate sale of the shipyard during any period of temporary incapacity. The proxy contained my signature. It was a convincing imitation, but not mine. Martin knew because my real signature had changed after hand surgery 4 years earlier. The forgery copied an older version from archived company records. Only 3 people had authorized access to those records, me, Martin, and Evan. My son had not been standing near the crime. He had helped build it. That night, I returned to the river house and sat in the dark kitchen. My late wife, Eleanor, had chosen every cabinet handle and fought me for months over the blue tile behind the stove. She had loved Evan fiercely, sometimes blindly. I wondered what she would have said if she had seen our son watching another person drug his father for a piece of land. Then I stopped asking dead people to answer questions meant for the living. I opened my laptop and began separating love from access. First came the company. Martin convened an emergency meeting with the independent directors. We suspended Evan's authority, froze his credentials, preserved every email, and notified the bank that no transaction involving Reed Marine could proceed without 2 outside signatures. Next came the house. Evan had used my property as collateral support for a business line I guaranteed 5 years earlier. I instructed the bank not to renew the guarantee. I revoked his access to my investment accounts, canceled the company card he carried, and removed him from my health proxy. None of those actions felt dramatic. They felt like shutting valves before a damaged vessel flooded. The most important change involved succession. Evan believed my incapacity would place Reed Marine in his hands. He did not know Eleanor and I had created a dormant protection clause after one of our partners suffered a stroke. Evidence of coercion, fraud, or undue influence by the named successor automatically disqualified that successor. Control would pass instead to an independent trust overseen by Martin and 2 senior employees. The trust's long-term beneficiary was Sophie. Not Evan, not Vanessa, Sophie. Eleanor had insisted on that structure because she once told me a business should pass to the person who respects what it feeds, not the person who only sees what it can be sold for. At the time, I thought she was being philosophical. 6 years after her death, she was still protecting us. Detective Briggs arranged the next step with the district attorney. They needed a current act tied directly to the existing evidence. I agreed to host dinner on Wednesday and pretend the memory evaluation was scheduled for Friday. The police supplied a marked travel mug and placed 2 recording devices in the kitchen after obtaining the necessary authorization. I hated turning my home into a trap. I hated more that it was necessary. Wednesday arrived heavy with summer rain. Evan came first, carrying groceries and avoiding my eyes. Vanessa followed in a cream suit, calm enough to make calmness look guilty. Sophie was already at Ruth's house under the excuse of a sleepover. Vanessa kissed my cheek, asked whether I had taken my afternoon medication, and began making coffee before the dinner plates were cleared. I told them the neurologist could see me Friday morning. Vanessa stopped stirring for half a heartbeat. Evan asked who recommended the doctor. I said Martin had arranged it. Vanessa smiled too quickly and replied that families should attend because patients sometimes minimize symptoms. I watched my son fold his napkin into smaller and smaller squares. He knew exactly what Friday was supposed to accomplish. Then I gave them the final push. I said I had reconsidered Hale Meridian's offer and might sign a letter of intent Thursday afternoon. Vanessa's spoon struck the mug. Evan looked up so fast his chair creaked. I pretended not to notice. If the evaluation goes well, I added, there's no reason to delay decisions. That sentence did what Detective Briggs expected. It made their deadline immediate. Vanessa carried my blue mug into the pantry outside what she believed was the camera's angle. The new recording device caught the rustle of paper and the scrape of a spoon. Evan entered behind her. His voice was barely audible. Use less this time. Vanessa answered. Less won't guarantee anything. He said my name once like a protest he wanted credit for making. She returned smiling and placed the coffee by my right hand. I lifted it, smelled it, and asked whether she had used the dark roast. She said yes. I looked at Evan. He stared at the table. That was his final chance. One sentence could have changed the shape of his guilt. He could have said, Dad, put it down. Instead, he reached for his water. I set the mug down untouched. Detective Briggs entered through the mudroom with 2 officers and an evidence technician. Vanessa's face did not collapse immediately. People like her need several seconds to accept that reality has stopped obeying them. She demanded a warrant, accused me of confusion, and told Evan to call Grant. Then the technician sealed the mug in front of all of us. Evan stood so quickly his chair fell backward. It wasn't poison, he said. Not what is happening, not why are the police here. His first sentence was a defense. Detective Briggs turned toward him and asked what he believed it was. He looked at Vanessa. She looked away. In that small movement, my son finally discovered what partnership with a coward feels like. Vanessa said the medication was mine and that she had been helping me sleep. Briggs asked for the prescription. Vanessa claimed it was verbal guidance from a wellness physician. The officer asked why the powder had been hidden inside a collagen container. She stopped answering. Evan began saying he never measured anything, never bought anything, never wanted me harmed. Each denial placed him closer to the center. They found more packets in Vanessa's purse and 2 prescription bottles in the pantry with labels removed. A search later uncovered draft sale agreements, the forged proxy, and emails between Vanessa, Grant, and Evan. One message from Evan read, Once Dad fails the assessment, the board can't stop me. Another asked whether Hale Meridian could increase his personal payout if the sale closed before year-end. That email removed the last excuse available to me. Evan had not been manipulated into silence. He had negotiated his reward. He had worried about dosage because he feared consequences, not because he cared enough to stop them. There is a brutal clarity in seeing the exact price someone placed on your safety. My son had valued mine beneath a development bonus and a corner office. Vanessa and Evan were arrested that night. Grant was picked up the following morning at the airport with a one-way ticket to Toronto. The laboratory confirmed the fresh coffee contained the same 2 sedatives as the original sample. Investigators also found my medical notes copied inside Vanessa's files with symptoms highlighted and dates selected to support a false incompetency petition. Sophie stayed with me under an emergency guardianship order. When I told her that her father would not be coming home, she did not cry immediately. She asked whether he had known. Children often ask the cleanest question, the one adults spend paragraphs avoiding. I said yes, he knew enough to stop it. Then she cried against my shirt until neither of us pretended we were all right. The board met Friday without Evan. 37 employees filled the training room because rumors had traveled through the yard. I told them the property was not being sold and that Reed Marine would continue operating. Men who had worked beside me for decades looked down at their hands. A young welder named Luis stood and said, Mr. Reed, this place fed my whole family. That was the secret Vanessa never understood. The shipyard was valuable because of the riverfront land, but its worth was larger than an appraisal. It paid mortgages, funded apprenticeships, and kept skills alive that developers considered inconvenient. Selling it might have made us rich once. Keeping it working allowed dozens of families to build lives every month. Ownership without stewardship is only appetite. Martin activated Eleanor's protection clause. Evan lost succession rights permanently. His shares were placed in a restricted trust pending the criminal case, and any future distributions could not be used to influence Sophie. The independent trustees assumed control if anything happened to me. The trap Evan built around my supposed incapacity had triggered the exact mechanism that removed him. There was one more twist he never saw coming. 6 months earlier, I had quietly transferred the River House into a family preservation trust after Vanessa suggested converting it into luxury rentals. Sophie held the future beneficial interest. Evan's guarantee his marriage and his legal claims could not touch it. He had risked my health to seize assets that were already moving beyond his reach. The prosecutor offered Evan a reduced charge if he cooperated fully against Vanessa and Grant. He accepted. Some relatives called that courage. I called it survival arriving late. His statement described meetings, forged records, and the staged videos of my confusion. He admitted he had convinced himself the doses were temporary and that I would never be seriously harmed. That phrase stayed with me, never seriously harmed, as though stealing someone's memory in small pieces becomes acceptable if he keeps breathing, as though making a father doubt his own mind is merely paperwork with side effects. I listened to the recorded statement once, then told Martin I never wanted to hear it again. Understanding an excuse does not make it worthy of respect. Vanessa pleaded guilty to aggravated assault evidence, tampering, forgery, and conspiracy. Grant pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy connected to the planned sale. Evan pleaded guilty to conspiracy, attempted exploitation of an elder, and falsifying corporate records. The judge gave him less time than Vanessa, but enough to ensure he could not call the outcome a misunderstanding. At sentencing, Evan looked toward me. For a moment I saw the boy who used to wait at the dock with a red plastic fishing pole, certain his father could repair anything. That memory hurt more than anger ever could. I did not look away, but I did not rescue him from the meaning of the room. Some repairs require the broken part to remain removed. Sophie never testified in open court. Her recorded interview, the camera footage, laboratory reports, and digital evidence made that unnecessary. I was grateful. She had already carried more truth than a child should. The court granted me permanent guardianship while preserving supervised written contact with Evan, subject to Sophie's therapist and her own wishes as she grew older. 3 weeks after sentencing, Sophie asked whether she had destroyed our family by warning me. We were sitting on the dock watching rain move across the river in silver lines. I told her families are not destroyed by the person who points at the fire. They are damaged by the people who strike the match, then ask everyone else to admire the warmth. She thought about that, then asked whether I still loved her father. I told her yes. Love does not disappear because someone becomes dangerous. It changes shape. Sometimes love means visiting, sometimes it means forgiving, and sometimes it means building a locked door between the person you love and the people they have chosen to harm. Evan wrote me 12 letters during his first year in prison. The early ones explained. The middle ones blamed Vanessa, grief, pressure, and fear of disappointing me. I returned none. The 10th letter contained no excuses. He wrote, I watched her put it in your cup and I wanted the company more than I wanted to be your son. That was the first honest sentence. I answered once. I told him honesty was not redemption, but it was the first tool required to build toward it. I said Sophie was safe, the yard was stable, and I would not discuss inheritance, employment, or early release. I also said I hoped he would become a man capable of understanding why those subjects no longer belonged in the same letter as love. Life at the River House changed. Ruth helped with school pickups. Lena became the person Sophie called when science homework turned impossible. Martin came for Sunday dinner and complained about my coffee as though nothing had happened. I replaced the pantry door not because I feared it, but because I refused to let one room remain shaped by Vanessa's secrecy. Sophie chose the new color, bright yellow. She said dark places should not get to stay dark after people tell the truth. I painted it myself badly. There are brush marks near the hinges and one drip I never sanded down. Every time I see it, I remember that survival does not always look elegant. Sometimes it looks like a child choosing sunlight for a door. I still drink coffee every morning. I grind the beans, fill the old percolator, and use the same blue mug. For months, Sophie watched every step. Then one Tuesday, she slept late, came downstairs, saw the empty cup beside me, and did not panic. That ordinary moment felt larger than any verdict. Trust had entered the kitchen again without asking permission. People have asked whether I regret turning my son over to the police. They phrase it more gently, but that is what they mean. My answer is no. I regret the choices that made it necessary. I regret every time I confused protection with parenting and every consequence I postponed because I wanted peace. But I do not regret choosing Sophie's safety over Evan's comfort. The laboratory found sedatives in my coffee. The investigation found greed inside my family. The court found crimes. But the hardest discovery was mine. A parent can love an adult child completely and still refuse to stand between him and what he has earned. Love without boundaries is not mercy. Sometimes it is simply a softer way of helping harm continue. Reed Marine Works is still open. The welders still arrive before sunrise. Boats still rise above the dry dock while the river turns gold. Sophie does homework in my office beneath a photograph of Eleanor, and the Succession Trust now funds apprenticeships in her name. What Evan tried to convert into quick money became harder to sell, harder to steal, and more useful than before. And every Sunday, Sophie sits across from me at the blue-tiled kitchen counter. She pours her hot chocolate. I pour my coffee. Before I take the first sip, she watches me for half a second, then smiles. She saved my life with 6 quiet words. I spent the months afterward making sure she never had to whisper the truth in her own home again. If this story stayed with you, remember the people who speak softly when everyone else benefits from silence. Believe the child who risks comfort to tell the truth. And never mistake a calm response for a weak one. Some men do not overturn the table when betrayed. They preserve the evidence, protect the innocent, and remove every chair the guilty thought belonged to them.